Welcome to another episode of the Love Procurement Podcast. My name is Kelly Barner, and I'll be your host for this conversation. Today, I'm glad to welcome Stephen Carter. He's the Director of Product Marketing at Ivalua, and he is going to share with us some modern lessons pulled from the history of procurement. So, hi, Steve. Thank you so much for being with me today.
Great to join you. Thank you.
Now, we have to do sort of a dual background on you. I would love to understand a little bit more about your professional journey to this point, but also where that gets intertwined with your love of history, which is the other thing we're going to talk about today.
Okay, brilliant. Yeah, certainly. So, my journey to this, where I am today has been a bit of an ramble, should we say? Started off in technology, did some coding, programming, worked on the old IBM mainframes. Anybody remembers those? And I've seen a lot of technical changes. And as my career's progressed, I've sort of really learned that what I've been actually doing the whole way through is helping finance teams either deliver invoices or pay invoices or work within systems. And I've always sort of taken an approach of looking at what happens on the ground, which is sort of what I love around product marketing, is being able to share ideas, help direct the future a little bit, and really deliver. But more recently, I actually had a great opportunity to join the UK government in their procurement team to look at some new innovation and run some procurement events. And I have to say that I actually enjoyed being on the procurement side rather than on the practitioner side, rather than being on the supplier side. It's more exciting somehow in some cases if you get it right. So I did that for a couple of years, and then I came to Evalua, where I've really head up all our invoicing and our payments and sustainability areas, and really help customers and R&D deliver for the future. So it's been a good fun journey, really. So yeah.
And then how about your background in history? Because that's something we're really going to dig into today, and certainly connect it to modern trends and things. But talk a little bit about that part of your experience, because that's not marketing or procurement.
It's not at all, no. So it's along my path, I've always been fascinated with history, and for a long time I did historical reenactment, where you sort of dress up in kit and you sort of do all that sort of stuff. And I rose up the ranks from a musketeer through to a colonel and ran a regiment. But I've also always been interested in all the history, the aspect of what happens really behind the scenes, and that transpired into a desire to write and to do research and to really explore certain periods of time to really learn the details. And luckily, when I actually went into procurement, I actually got a life-work balance correct and had time to write. And I wrote my first book and got it published. And since then I've done two more or three. In fact, just actually put my fourth manuscript in. So there'll be 4 books out in the sort of by the middle of this year. And it's my secondary passion. I just love history, and I love exploring and researching the facts behind history.
Well, and congratulations on the 4 books. Although I will tell you, so some people are listening to this conversation as audio only, but we're also capturing video. This is the very first time I've ever had the regret that I didn't think to ask you to come in period dress for the conversation. This is apparently a completely missed opportunity. I dropped the ball on that one because that would have been a procurement podcast first.
I could have done. Possibly next time round, I can wear my wig and my frock coat. But yeah,
there we go. We'll have you back for that. Now, you've mentioned the fact that you love history, certainly, and you mentioned in your earlier background that you love product marketing. On theme with this podcast, what is something that you love about procurement?
I think I'll put my both hats on. So from a practitioner perspective, procurement is something that you can make a change. It makes a difference to any organization, and it can make a total difference to where a business goes, whether it makes money, doesn't make money, how it progresses. So for me, it's quite, as I say, what I said earlier, it's quite an exciting place to be. And on both sides, both as a supplier and as a actual buyer of technology, I think right now, particularly with the focus on sustainability and other aspects and diversity, procurement can make a real difference. Yeah. And that to me is I think it's really why it's powerful. But the second reason, my historical reason, is there's a saying which is follow the money. And in history, it's something you can really do. So I can follow the historical money, and I can see the 17th century procurement chain from the king asking for, he wants this, all the way through to the suppliers delivering it, the suppliers being paid, and then them using that actually in the battlefield. So you can trace, there's always a paper trail or digital paper trail of activities. And that's the other really beautiful thing about procurement. There's rules you follow, and that means there's documents that you follow, and it's an untapped source of history that I've been using.
Now, we are going to talk about that history today, but much of your research and writing has been focused on a very specific period in British history. Could you, before we dig into the details, just start us off by setting the stage? Where are we? Who's in charge? What's going on? What's sort of the backdrop to what we're going to discuss today?
Okay, so the period I've been studying is a snapshot in time at 1685, when the Duke of Monmouth rebels against King James II, who's just come to the throne. And there's a number of reasons for that rebellion. Possibly one of them is that he may well have been the legitimate heir. So was Charles II, his father, married to Lucy Walters, his mother? That's one of the big historical debates. And when Monmouth rebels, there's a big groundswelling of people that support him. And this is not just a flash in the pan. It's quite a big event that history is really sort of ignored. But the beauty of it's a snapshot. And because of that, you can really focus in on the people and the characters that happened in this period of time. But also it means you can, like, from a signposting perspective, when you start to look at it, it's got a great example of how an army was organized, how it was formed, how it fought, but also the political machinations around it. And then, the wider context of, was he legitimate? Was Lucy married to Charles II, which is the topic of my 5th book, but yeah.
Well, good for you for already being planning ahead to book number 5. And it's interesting because you talk about military activity, and certainly regardless of what period of history you study, regardless of what geography you happen to be focused on, as sad and as unfortunate as they are, military activity and warfare do drive a lot of change that have silver lining benefits. I mean, we've seen wars bring economies out of depression. Businesses innovate because there's pressure and there's a freeing of resources and a motivation to do so. But through history, I mean, an army marches on its belly, right? As George Washington said, to bring an example from across the pond.
Yeah.
Armies have to acquire goods, and they tend to have a formality in their approach to everything. How would you characterize the either formality or lack thereof to the military procurement that was happening during this time?
Okay, so that's a great question, because we have a misconception when we look back on history as being everything being antiquated, etc., and not happening. But I can safely say, if we took a procurement person listening to this podcast today, put them in the 17th century procurement room of the Ordnance Department, they would have exactly the same problems that they got today then. And they'd have systems to follow that are almost identical to modern systems. The procurement process is almost identical. The challenges are identical. So ultimately, the problem is the same. And the only difference really is the technology they're using to do it. And that, I think that's a really important aspect of it. So when I look at it from what we think people didn't do, certainly in 1685, there was a procurement team on both sides, both in the government and, interestingly, on the rebels side. There are lots of really fascinating documents like shipping mandates that show the weapons they purchased, which again demonstrate a degree of organization that an army had to have to be formed. And that's why 1685 is such a fascinating time, because you've got it's a snapshot literally of an army being formed to invade, and the government responding to that in a well-documented environment.
Now, it's interesting that you point out that while the tools are different, many of the challenges remain the same. I mean, effectively, then as now, you're buying things and moving them from here to there, and hopefully they arrive at the right place, in the right quantity, at the right time. what were some of the sources of innovation or new ways of doing things that would have been connected to that procurement and supply management process back then that might even offer us some insight into some of those similar challenges that we're facing today?
Okay, so yeah, there are a number of really good examples, and I'm going to focus a little bit more on the rebel side, on Monmouth's side, if you like, because he's got a bigger challenge. So, yeah, unbelievably, looking back, he had to hire warehouses to store the weapons. He had to go out and send people out to go and buy from different manufacturers and get those shipped in undercover, like secretly, and store these in warehouses. And there were like spy reports of barges going down the river from Liège to Rotterdam, where the weapons were being stored. He then had to ship them and move them onto the ships, and then quite an intricate shipping organization to get that done. There was also some innovation he had. So one of the things that we can follow the paper trail from literally from them being used on the battlefield to being purchased. You see, he actually went out and he bought some of the latest weapons technology to equip his cavalry with. These are actually quad barrel pistols and double barrel carbines, which were far more superior than what the government army had.
Mm.
So yeah, he went off, he discovered them, the team went off and effectively looked at it. And the amazing thing is there's also a spy report from the government saying that Monmouth's bought these weapons, and the government actually go off and buy one to test it. And that's so, but then you get the other account, this later account where the government cavalry trooper who's on the battlefield, it complains that the rebels have got better weapons than he has. So you can see these innovations creeping in, and that it's a challenge to equip an army and then ship it. If you think about it, shipping it from Holland all the way to the West Country in England and also into Scotland, and you're relying on weather and all sorts of other factors that are going to disrupt that trade. Let alone the government with their warships waiting for them to come out of the harbour, which they have to avoid.
Now, I love history, but this is not a time period that I was familiar with. So I did my homework. And Steve, I actually listened to a podcast interview that you did that was focused specifically on the Monmouth Rebellion. And there were a couple of things sort of coming to that fresh and thinking of it in the context of procurement that occurred to me as connections between what was happening back then and some of the things we struggle with in business today. Now, one of those was based on your experience actually as a reenactor. You talked about traditional history books covering the rebellion as, and this I believe is a quote from you, describing it as a ramble about Somerset, meaning people were taking back roads and sort of going through the woods versus traveling via main road. And you realized that there was a problem with that version of history when you tried to stage a reenactment based on those accounts. What was it that you realized was a problem?
Well, okay, so actually the quote was from an author called David Chandler, and it's been a
Thank you.
historical myth around this. But so what I discovered really was that the roads have totally changed. So we have and I'll use an analogy. Today we think of our shipping containers coming through the Suez Canal, and we've got this mentality that this is always what happens. We get a very fixed view of how things work. We remove that, and suddenly things take a lot longer. And what has happened over time is that obviously roads have changed, rivers have changed, and when you actually analyze what Monmouth did and how he marched and the challenges he faced, he was actually using all what were in those days the main roads. And that creates a different perspective on how long it takes to travel, what the challenges were. So, for example, a hill that we drive past today on the highway, back then was a major challenge to get up and down it.
Yeah.
So little things like that. So when historians or people look back at time, they have a vision of what it looked like today, and they try and superimpose that on there. And the analogy really on a supply chain is literally this. Things are always changing. And if you take a snapshot, you need to really go back on the ground to make sure that map is correct. In other words, there may be this problem that looks on the map like a straight line. Actually, it goes through a swamp. There's challenges, and sometimes this is, you need to be on the ground sometimes or get closer to it to really understand the challenges that people face, and the ways around that challenge.
And I do think that's a valid lesson. And it's a pain that I think a lot of procurement teams and stakeholders feel when you have a beautiful, centrally drafted strategy document, but you don't have anybody literally walking those roads. You don't have anybody being those boots on the ground to say, is this process going to work? Is this tool or this interface going to meet the needs of the users? Does it even align with how the business operates today? It seems like in some cases, especially when adoption and compliance are the focus within procurement, we can run into those challenges because it looks great from our seat at headquarters or from a home office. But if you're not in a distribution center or a decentralized facility attempting to use the solution sort of in the wild, you run into very much that same problem.
You do, and actually more recently I've done more research for the push my next book, my volume 2 of Science for Arms, and looking back at it through all the documentation, the manuals, the other fascinating thing that I've now really realised is they didn't just use one road; they would have used multiple roads, and they'd looked at it the day beforehand. How am I going to split the army up? How am I going to move through this part? Where are my bottlenecks? How do I avoid the bottlenecks? And they were literally going down to that level of planning to look at how they moved the army, and then how they structured the army to suit the landscape. So they were constantly changing. So it wasn't just this linear army or movement of serial process of, they would split it into multiple columns, they'd move into one, they'd send one group another way that's slower. There was a lot of doctrine around it that, again, we don't really think of, going back in time, we think that's a modern thing. But no, it was what they did. They would look at the landscape and work out what the best routes were. But you had to be there because suddenly a bridge could break and you had to fix the bridge. So you had to really look at that.
Now, the other connection that I heard from the conversation is related to the Earl of Argyll in Scotland. He staged a rebellion in parallel to Monmouth, and you had made the comment that his challenge was that he was fighting two battles at once. So he was certainly fighting the literal battle on the field, but he was also having difficulty with his own war council. You're welcome to add any color and additional detail that you think is necessary there. But why do you think that two-front war was detrimental to the Earl of Argyll's likelihood of success?
So just to recap, so what Argyll's doing, so the Monmouth is supposed to land and Argyll is supposed to land at the same time. Okay, so this is just an example of the logistic challenges, but Monmouth couldn't leave until a fortnight later, and then he hit bad weather. So Argyll was there a month in Scotland before Monmouth landed. So obviously the two invasions were supposed to be synchronized, but because of weather, transportation, logistics, it didn't happen. But Argyll was struggling because his council of war, to put that into a phrase, would be like the executive board, if you like. And so Argyll is sort of the CFO of the organization. He's supposed to be running the circle, if you like, and he's got his procurement team and his finance team going off, and he's got his organization there. But what he couldn't do was create a centralized view they all supported. So one part of the Council of War was supporting one concept, one ambition, one objective. The other part was focusing on another ambition, an objective. And then the third one, which is the elephant in the room, was that they were all looking to a higher body. They were very religious, and that was almost like shadowing everything else. So he was the CFO, but the religious body above them was actually the church, was actually the CFO, and they couldn't make their mind up either. CEO, sorry. So he was trying to fight this multiple battle, and the only way he could do it was sort of almost tell the Council of War one thing and then do something else. And then when the board realised that he wasn't doing what they expected, they'd then kick up, and then he'd have to change his plans. So it's constantly having to react to not only what the enemy was doing, but also to what his own army was doing, his own sort of his CFO was doing or CEO was doing. And so people under him were not following orders, and they thought they were with him, equal to him. So it just demonstrates a lack of vision and a lack of focus that he really struggled with. And luckily for King James II, he did have those problems. Otherwise, it would have been a very different history. So.
Well, and hopefully procurement doesn't have actual literal enemies, but I do think we are constantly challenged in a similar way, fighting a battle on multiple fronts. And whether that's dealing with policy changes that are coming out differently from different parts of the C-suite, while also trying to satisfy distributed buyers, or whether that's on the one hand looking at cost versus sustainability versus risk mitigation, all of these different objectives we're trying to satisfy. Can you offer it? You use the word vision. What advice would you offer to modern procurement, sort of based on what the Earl may have learned from his experience, to deal with the multi-front battle, but not to be quite so disadvantaged because of it?
Well, I think it's difficult to put myself in Argyle's shoes, to be totally honest, because I think he didn't have the leadership qualities. But what he did do was he did manage to rally his procurement teams to buy a lot of equipment that he needed for his army. So he used a strategy that I think it's just applicable as it is today. And I think this is the same strategy was used by the government and by Monmouth. And that was that procurement teams, and this is where you can really, history tells us this story. So without any technology, they have a problem with the supply chain, and they're looking for innovation, they're looking for all these things. And what they all do is they all have a pool of suppliers they work with. They all have a number of trusted suppliers that they know will raise up and do things when they need them. So to keep them in business, what they would do historically, they would manufacture of muskets, the primary firearm at the time. They would have 6 or 7 suppliers of that weapon, and to keep all those suppliers in business, they would drip feed them contracts, small bits of business, so that they can make sure that they had the abilities and the capacity to up their game, if you like. And then they would then, when the war came along, they'd issue their orders out to these for higher volumes, and so they'd be keeping the pool of suppliers going. And then at times of crisis, they'd share the load across multiple suppliers, which is a technique that I think in our sort of safe world, we've sort of almost forgotten that, we're trying to cut down the number of suppliers,
Yes.
but when there's a critical commodity, you need a pool of suppliers that can support you with that criticality. And otherwise you do risk all sorts of problems with your supply chain. And the other thing that Argyle did that was quite clever, he managed to ship arms for 10,000 soldiers across the North Sea, all the way around the top of Scotland to Argyleshire, offload them into a castle. He managed to do that with quite a small team of 300, basically 300 people. That was actually a really amazing logistical thing to have done. He just couldn't, then when he landed, he couldn't get all his men fighting in the right direction. That's a different problem. But he got everybody there, and he got all the equipment needed. He just didn't really deliver on the promise he made to Monmouth.
Yeah. Now, to the point of equipment, there's one story you shared with me the last time we spoke that I will be so disappointed if we don't capture for the listeners. And this was the story of the tents. Steve, tell me the story of the tents, because to me, this is a glowing moment of historical procurement excellence.
It absolutely is. I mean, it's one of those things that when you're a historian and you're writing things, there's like eureka moments. One of those eureka moments was discovering the man who bought Monmouth's coats. That was quite an amazing thing. But the other one was there's the very last thing that happens in the Monmouth Rebellion is a big battle at Sedgemoor, and the Parliament, the government officer, the Earl of Argy, has to get his army as close to Monmouth as possible, and to do that he needs tents, because the army needs to camp in tents, otherwise it camps in a village and it gets very disruptive very quickly. And he realizes this because of Monmouth's quite a wily character. His army's quite skilled, actually. And he realizes this after a bit of a bloody nose at an encounter, that he needs tents. And he writes back to basically the procurement director, if you like, the British Army, the Master of Ordnance, and says, I need tents. And otherwise I can't fight Monmouth. So a few days later, these tents arrive. but they arrive a lot quicker than they should have done. And the reason is when the army was formed and the supply column moved forward, the procurement team who were loading up the wagons realised that they needed tents, and but they weren't on the official orders, so they didn't have an order to load some wagons with tents. They just realised that actually they need tents because there's not enough tents for the army. They did the maths and they said, okay, we need to get those out of stores. They put them into the wagons. So these things arrived with Faversham before he expected them to arrive. And it was because the procurement team realised that actually, although they hadn't had the order, we need tents, they realised that they need tents. And they made sure they had them on the wagons and they were there. And that was actually allowed Faversham to move his army closer to Monmouth. And that allowed them to have a battle. And that made him effectively meant that the tents meant his army could form up really quickly and beat Monmouth on the battlefield. So,
and in that way, procurement changed the course of history, didn't we?
It did, absolutely. It changed the course of history. And it's one of those amazing things when you only see that or learn that when you look at the paper trail. So I saw the letter going out saying, please send more tents. And there was an order that was before that letter came in to put tents on the wagons. So they guessed. There you go. So procurement saved the day, unfortunately for King James II. But yeah, that's
Excellent.
life.
Well, Steve, this has been absolutely fascinating. And what I would like to do is sort of wrap up our conversation by giving you an opportunity to share the love. So, what piece of advice or what little thought would you like to leave our listeners with?
Okay, I think I would like to just, we're going back to a period of disruption effectively. And I think, history is full of disruption. And I think we've been quite safe the last 30 years around procurement, 40 years possibly. It's been very safe, and we've become into the sort of mentality that it isn't disruptive. But when we look at history, everything is disruptive, and I think we need to get back into that mindset. It's a bit like the thing I said about suppliers. People need to, think about the risks and make sure there's multiple suppliers in place to give them the love they need to deliver what they have to deliver. So that tent example, there wasn't one tent manufacturer, there was 3 tent manufacturers. And when they needed those tents for 3,000 soldiers, they had a ready supply because they had a good supply chain. They had a good base of suppliers to deliver those tents. And that, you have to be flexible, agile in life. And with disruption, nothing is ever going to go to plan. And that's one of the big lessons. Nothing goes to plan. I think it wasn't Napoleon, but it was somebody else that said, a plan goes out the window as soon as it starts. And we have to get back into that mindset.
Well, not exactly as historical, but I actually think it was Mike Tyson. Everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. I think,
Okay,
was his quote. Talk about the extent of history and time and figures to look to, Steve. If
Yes.
people have listened to this conversation or have watched our interview and they would like to get in touch with you, whether they want to talk about procurement or they want to talk about the Monmouth Rebellion, what is the best way for them to find you?
Okay, so I have a really simple website. It's warwalks.com, so WARWALKS. And that's my website. But I'm also, if you do on LinkedIn or Twitter or X, whatever it's called, or even Threads these days, that's my handle. So you can find me with that on LinkedIn as well. So, and on LinkedIn, it's more my business profile. I do a bit of history in there occasionally, but my website and my X, it's really, I push quite a lot of historical content out.
Excellent, Steve. Well, thank you so much for being with me today and sharing both of your perspectives.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.